Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. WitchLit is brought to you by Thousand Bolt Press, a family-owned independent publisher established to produce the books we want to see in the world. Titles including Changing Paths by Yvonne A. Burrow, Conjuring the Commonplace by Lane Fuller and Corey Thomas Hutchison, and my latest book, Verona Green, can be purchased directly from thousandvoltpress.com or wherever you buy books. Jarod K. Anderson has 3 best-selling collections of nature poetry, A Field Guide to the Haunted Forest, Love Notes from the Hollow Tree, and Leaf Litter. His memoir, Something in the Woods Loves You, come out from Timber Press later this year in 2024. Explores his lifelong struggle with depression through a lens of love and gratitude for the natural world. Jarod created and voices the CryptoNaturalist podcast, a scripted audio fiction show about real adoration for imaginary wildlife. Jarod has gained a large audience, over 250,000 followers across social media platforms, with his vivid appreciations of nature and his open, vulnerable discussions of mental health. He has an eclectic career ranging from teaching college English courses after earning his MA in literature to managing marketing and events for academic and ecological nonprofits. He lives in Ohio between a park and a cemetery. Jarod K. Anderson, welcome to WitchLit.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. And, for being game, for someone just randomly sending you a direct message on socials.
Of course. I like to talk poetry and writing and anything else you'd like.
Funnily enough, you're in the right place. So, as you know, we have a traditional question for everybody on the show. So our first question for all my guests is, and I think this is especially interesting for you because you do so much of your work on social media. Why write? Why still write books?
Yeah, I've heard you ask that. I've listened to some other episodes, and funny part was I hadn't really thought of it until you brought it up a minute ago. But it's an easy answer for me. Because I struggle with depression and it can really be a sapper of motivation. And it can really ask the what's the point question over and over again. So this is definitely a question I've come across inside my own head. And for me, it's all about connection. I think part of the magic in writing is just reaching out and making connections mind to mind, and that's writing's greatest strength. I mean, I love it as a craft and an art form, but if you ask me what I love best about it, it's that aspect of connection. And in terms of social media, for a very long time I was a more traditional writer and academic, and I would write piles of poetry and fiction and novels, and they'd go in drawers, and I would send them to academic journals, and that was it. I wouldn't post anything online because then I couldn't try to sell it or place it somewhere. It eventually hit me that writing as service is something that really motivates me. The idea that my writing is helpful or meaningful to somebody else. And then when I go down that road, it's like, all right, well, why not post it wherever I can, instead of holding it back to show to various writing gatekeepers. So that's really why I write, and also why I spend so much time posting things on social media.
I mean, did you I think about I think there's a question on your blog somewhere. Someone said, should you submit to magazines? Should you do all this stuff? And you're like, maybe things have changed. So is that kind of what took you to doing poetry on social media?
Yeah, I mean, I still do submit to magazines from time to time, but and I love them. I like print media. I love poetry journals, online and physical. But if you think about traditionally what those sort of publishers offered, it was really the only pathway to reaching readers. And that's not true anymore. It can be a good pathway to reach sort of a niche audience. But if you want to write in terms of connecting, or to write to have a conversation, or to to sort of feel that dynamic action of making meaning between you and an audience, there aren't a lot of reasons, I feel like, not to just try to reach a community directly. Like I said, I still submit to journals, and I love it. I mean, I love, patting a poem on the head and sending it off on an adventure and seeing what happens. And I love traditional publishing, and I still buy a lot of traditionally published things. But the question of, hey, should I focus on my energy on sending to journals and magazines often comes to me from newer writers. And yeah, that was certainly how I cut my teeth. But, for me, it's just like write a lot and find the people online who care about what you're writing, find people who you like their stuff. And you don't really have to ask too many other folks for permission anymore to get in touch with those people directly and start sharing work back and forth. And then I think community kind of rises up organically around those sorts of intentions.
So thinking about that being online and that direct conversation with readers, like what has that feedback been like? Because I feel like for a lot of writing, you don't really get real-time feedback, but with social media and poetry, you really do.
Yeah. It's almost, I mean, it's mostly been lovely. Mm-hmm. I will say that it took some time for me to kind of get the hang of what I think of as internet hygiene, where, if somebody is a real jerk, for a long time, I used to say that my problem was I was thinking of them as somebody at my house for a dinner conversation. And I eventually realized, no, this is somebody shouting at me from a moving car, and that I didn't need to engage with them like somebody at the table. I needed to engage with them like somebody shouting from a moving car and just turn away. Where I realized there wasn't some sort of moral imperative on me to humor everybody who wanted to sort of lob criticism my way. And I'm fine with criticism. That's not really what I mean, but it took me a while to really get more liberal with that mute and block button, and decide that I had sort of a responsibility to my own mental health to curate my online spaces. Once I figured that out, it became a lot more it became a lot more pleasant to sort of have my community and build the community, and realizing that I was also doing it for the people who enjoyed my work, that I wasn't letting those spaces let the air get taken up by somebody who was really just there to lob hand grenades.
Oh, yeah, block button is a gift. But so I was thinking about that, like in context of like, I think, like as a writer, and you too have an MA in literature. So I thought about this too, is this like, when you take that into your own hands, when you take having that conversation with readers into your hands, self-publishing, publishing through social media, whatever you do, did you have that, I guess, like for me, the issue with I had initially with self-publishing was, am I a real author? That like academic voice in the back of my head going, oh, no, someone has to gatekeep this and tell you, like bonk you on the head, you're for real. Did you have that?
Oh, absolutely. I had such a stigma against any kind of self-publishing. I had a stigma about posting work directly online. That's just like not how you did it. Mm-hmm. You put it away until somebody with authority could come and tell you that you'd done it, that you were allowed to call yourself a writer. So that took me a long time to get over. And I mean, it's funny when the poetry collections came about like this. I started deciding it was okay to just be very enthusiastic about the nature poetry I wrote. And so I started sharing it. And doing that in connection with the podcast, it started to grow a community. And eventually people started to ask me to publish collections. They wanted physical copies. And so, that was a first. And so I started looking around at small presses, and sort of my academic brain kicked in. And I thought to myself, okay, well, how do you publish poetry collections? well, you pay a fee to submit to university press contests, and then you wait a year and a half. And, the prospect of that was like, okay, that is so far away from the spirit with which I've been approaching this whole thing. And I wrote to one of my favorite authors, Jeff Vandermeer, um, and uh, here's a capital A author in the traditional publishing sense. And I kind of asked what he thought about it because in a weird quirk of the internet, this was one of my favorite authors and he seemed happy to chat with me. And he was like, just publish it. Just absolutely publish it. And he said for poetry, especially, there was no reason not to. Um, and I mean, that's kind of the funny thing about poetry. Traditionally, the feeling about poetry is there's no money in it. So there's a kind of freedom with that came with that when I was thinking about publishing it, with a real sort of, well, why not? Like, um, I, once I started to tell myself, okay, this isn't about prestige. Go back to that original motivation. You were doing this to connect with people. Then I sort of found the headspace to give myself permission to self-publish the poetry, because the point was to create an artifact, physical thing to connect with people and to reach a wider audience. It wasn't to build an item on my CV.
Yeah. I like that someone else kind of said, yeah, no, this is fine. But yeah, it's so funny to me, like that, the ingrainedness of this idea that someone else is like, are there any other professions? And I think someone else said this on the show where someone else has to tell you what you are.
Yeah.
Or like you have this thing in your head. Like, do you, like dentists have imposter syndrome? Like, it's real funny to me, like how creatives have this, like, I don't know, about need for validation, maybe in a way that doesn't exist in other ways.
But you see, like dentists have like accreditation boards and continuing education requirements and stuff. Whereas we have to make our own meaning.
Mm-hmm.
You have to give yourself permission to kind of to wear the writer mantle. But the quirk of writing is, that's how it's done though. Like it's really fraught to try to wait for somebody else to hold the permission back from you, or to have the responsibility of determining when you're a writer. Like that's sort of creative poison in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
The upside of it, if there is that those gatekeepers traditionally have been like a point of tension that you push against, sort of like almost in the strength training sense, where you push and push and push, and that does make you better. So like the only downside, I think, if there is one, to how easy it is to publish our own material now is that we kind of have to become our own points of resistance, where you have to find that internal reason to keep pushing and sharpening and trying to get better at your craft. Although, it also happens organically when you just read a bunch and write a bunch, which is nice.
Yeah. It's funny you bring up reading. Like, I think, I did my graduate degree in poetry confession.
Nice.
Though I don't publish it now. But I mean, I just remember several times people saying, oh, the only people who read poets are other poets, which I don't think is actually true. But I do think a lot of people who read poetry are also poets.
So that's a thing I get a lot that I like, is I get a whole bunch of DMs that say, hey, I don't really read poetry, but I like your poetry. And I mean, the easy one is, hey, I've never really read poetry, but I like your poetry. What else should I read?
Oh, nice.
Like, oh, good news. Go ahead and Google Mary Oliver, or I mean, the list is endless. So I often think of what I do when I have on my academic hat. I think of what I do is, I joke, belligerently accessible, where like I am trying to utterly reject the thing I did when I was younger, where it's like I thought of poetry as a way to seem smart, or I really, your self-esteem is in doubt, and you really need people to think that you're a genius with these poems. And so in the like T.S. Eliot tradition, trying to write these like dense, oh, what a genius, I have to decode this kind of poetry. Um, and as I got older and more confident in myself and sort of more on firm footing as to what I liked and why I was doing it, all that stuff went out the window. And then it's like, if I'm writing to connect, then I'm also writing to be understood. And so I think because that facet of my work exists, I sometimes end up being a gateway for people to discover a wider world of poetry. Um, and when I run into those people, I also like will tell them like, don't approach poetry like a homework assignment. Like, love the language, the ones that resonate with you, good. The ones that don't, move on. I like audio collections sometimes of poetry for that reason, because the good ones, the ones that are a gut punch, will connect. The ones that don't, you'll kind of automatically tune out. And you can kind of love the language in that way, which I think is how it's meant to be enjoyed.
Yeah. I mean, I think of how many poetry readings I've been to, and you're right. It's just different listening to either the author or even somebody else read the poems themselves, than to read it. Like, I think, poetry has a tiny advantage over prose in that you have more control over the line break and emphasis than I guess you do in prose, just because it appears on the page. But it's still different when the poet reads it.
Yeah. Yeah, I know when I write fiction or nonfiction too, there's almost, because of that lack of control, it's sort of a muscle of trusting the reader too at that point, that they'll get the emphasis or they'll get the joke or they'll, because in a poetry, you can set something off on its own line. You can make it look important on the page in a way that you can't. I mean, when I finished my nonfiction book, my memoir, that was a huge part of all last year. I sort of apologized to editors where I said, look, I love fragments. I love to set things apart on their own line because, I think in poetry terms a lot of the time. So I was like, I'm not going to be difficult. I'm absolutely collaborative in this process, but heads up, you're going to see me do this a lot, and it's intentional. So, help me flag it where it doesn't work. But it's one of those cases of it's like I know the rules, I'm breaking them on purpose. Help me determine when it works and when it doesn't.
Yeah, I know I'm with you on the fragments. And maybe I hadn't thought about before. Maybe that does come from writing poetry. Because my editor often points out that I'm the queen of fragments.
Well, I mean, you can throw a comma at the end of a sentence and then do like a qualifying phrase, but if you really want it to hit, I like to do a fragment, that stands with a period, with that full stop. Like, it's just another tool in the toolbox. And if we get away from being too concerned with correctness, I don't know why we wouldn't reach for that tool.
Yeah. No,
except that we don't want to alienate readers,
Yeah. And I think I am definitely of the, what is it? Prescriptive versus proscript or descriptive. I'm definitely on the descriptive.
Oh, yeah.
End of like what's correct in language. Like, how do people actually talk? What is, it's that to me is more meaningful.
That's what it is when anyone's honest. I mean, all you have to do is look at the level at which language changes over the years and understand that the dictionary is descriptive rather than prescriptive. Like, it changes as usage changes. I mean, what was it? Didn't I feel like irregardless made it into the dictionary recently? I mean, because the usage is so widespread and, that's real sort of grammar and language traditionalists sort of hate that. But, my master's is in Renaissance poetry. I mean, Shakespeare and Paradise Lost and gang, that wasn't that long ago, and language has changed dramatically. Like that's just how it works. And I love that because, of course, it's a thing that changes with the people. We don't press ourselves into the mold of language. Language follows us.
I always joke, people are like, oh, but Shakespeare invented all these words and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, he probably did come up with some, but a lot of them were probably just spoken that had never been written down before, or we don't have extant writing that include them. I said, but when I do it, I'm wrong. That word doesn't exist. And I was like, no, that's not how it works.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the privileges of being a writer or a poet, is that you can absolutely do that. And what determines if you're allowed? Whether or not you get away with it.
Yeah.
Whether or not you've created something that that will resonate.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like, obviously with the name like WitchLit for the podcast, I think there is certain magic in capturing things in language. And, I think language is powerful and really is its own magic in a lot of ways. And
absolutely.
I kind of wanted to ask you, like, kind of your thoughts on that, I guess. Just, feel free to riff on that as a theme.
I mean, I was having a beer with a buddy the other day, and he was asking me about social media and people who follow me on social media, and I said that it's interesting. There are distinct groups that show up that are very represented. And he said, "Oh, like what?" And I was like, "Well, scientists, naturalists, witches." And we were going on and on. It was just like, some of this could seem sort of like unusual crossover, but it isn't to me. Because for me, the heart of all of it is meaning making, which is very essential to what my view of magic is. And I have a whole chapter on magic in the book coming out in September. Because I was raised by atheists, but my mom took me on a nature walk every day and referred to the woods as her church, and endlessly taught me about wildflowers and animals and kind of nature lore in general, which is what she was taught. And we didn't have holy seasons or holidays, but we started to pay attention when the Mayaples looked right, because we knew morel season was coming. And as I got older and leaned into education more, and I started to get kind of that hardcore rigidity version of atheism, especially because I was an English major who took science classes for science majors. And it hit me at some point that fact and meaning were two distinct and separate things. And that while facts were important, they weren't more important than meaning. And meaning wasn't a found object in the universe. It was a craft. It was something that involved interpretation and collaboration with the physical world. And so that idea of meaning making and our role and agency in meaning making kind of started to coalesce, along with my love and adoration for nature, into my sort of version of spirituality and my version of magic. And all of that just dovetails perfectly with the way I think about writing as well. Where it's the synthesis of fact into meaning. We have all these units of meaning and words, and okay, what can we do with it? What new thing can we create? In what way can we exercise our interpretive power to make something new and unique and powerful that serves us? And so, yeah, the concept of magic for me is woven throughout all of those ideas. I'll often say that, meaning is the nectar of facts being synthesized into the honey of meaning. And I occasionally, will run into people who will say, well, okay, so you're saying the universe is meaningless? And it's like, well, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's meaningless until we make meaning. Like it's like saying the idea that that is grim or sad would be like thinking that it's sad that honey doesn't exist when a bee is born into the world. It's like, well, bees have the capacity to make what they need. Like, no, human meaning, I feel like, isn't just ripening out there in the field to be plucked from a branch. Like, and it's good that it's not, because part of the magic of it, like part of what makes it special and important and potent, is our role in it and the way that we shape it as it shapes us. Um, that's a long-winded answer, but I think you can see how all of that is tied into making meaning through writing, which feels like a very pure form of making meaning to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, what is the human consciousness is the universe trying to figure itself out kind of idea. I mean, I've butcheredly paraphrased that from somebody. But yeah, like for me, like, I've never answered the why right question on the show because I'm usually the one asking the question. But for me, it's like, it's the only way to make sense of what's going on in my brain.
Yeah.
Like it is a way to order my own thoughts and order my own thinking about things in a way that nothing else approaches that really. I mean, therapy, nothing else will do it like writing will do it. So.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also married to a talented writer, and we will sometimes say back and forth that I don't really know what I think about something until I write it down. Mm-hmm. Because while it's all abstract and nebulous in your brain, it can kind of be like mist or smoke, and it can kind of change as you reach for it. Mm-hmm. But when you lock it into kind of a physical form on the page, okay, now it's something that has sort of rigidity, and you can have a conversation with it. Mm-hmm. You can kind of interrogate the hard edges of it and really figure out what you believe. But until you write it down, for me, it's like, it's smoke and mirrors.
Yeah. Well, and I think for me too, like I love that you said, kind of interrogate it when you write it down, because then I'm also like, is this thought actual bullshit? Now that it's on paper, like it's much more like, that's kind of garbage, Victoria. Like, why would you think that?
Well, and it's huge for somebody like me with chronic major depression, is it's like, I'll sometimes talk about fighting depression is like fighting a ghost, where it can hit you, but you can't hit it. Like its fists are hard, but you reach for it and it's back to mist. And so for me to write down kind of harmful or toxic ideas that are persistent in my brain, that's like getting a chain around its ankle to where it's like, oh, this this kind of enemy inside my own walls was invisible, and now I've made it visible. Now I can have the conversation with it and see the manipulations of it. So that's been a real powerful tool in terms of my mental health as well.
Mine is, I wrestle with anxiety, which is kind of the same kind of experience. And the thing about, I always tell anxiety is that anxiety is like being in fight or flight mode all the time.
Yeah.
And my actual response is freeze. So being able to write about it and have that space is, I don't know what I would do.
Yeah. My wife, Leslie, hers is anxiety. And so we're a fun duo that way. We can kind of compare notes.
Yeah.
But you're right. There's so many parallels of the like persistent thought distortion that haunts us in different ways. And haunt is kind of a key word with that ghost metaphor. And until you find a way to make it real, to kind of conjure it and make it appear, it's really hard to do anything with it, either to make friends with it or to banish it, or because it's too abstract. All the meaning making talk too, the quote of humans are how the universe understands it. So I get that in spirit, but I always bristle a little bit about that, because to me, like, the universe has its own essential character and dignity, and it doesn't need filtered through humans to be what it is. So for me, it's like, no, we're not how the universe understands itself. Humanity is a prism through which, we make a certain kind of light, a certain kind of spectrum of colors out of the light of the universe. And then what's fun about that is every human being is a slightly different kind of prism.
Yeah.
And that's another reason writing is important, is because you can see the character of the way the light changes when it passes through different people. And that teaches you about them, but it also teaches you about yourself. And it's also, since writing is crafted in the way that we're talking about, where you sort of have to figure out what you mean before you write it down, even more than speech. I think sometimes it's a way to connect with other people because you're seeing sort of a distillation of the light, if we continue that prism metaphor.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's just another way in which I think writing is just a really awesome tool for seeing. And seeing something clearly is sometimes the first step in terms of connecting on a deeper level, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I like your approach to the consciousness in the universe. Mine is always that I don't think we're actually separate. I think it's all one thing.
Sure. Yeah.
But I do like that. I do think that it's very true that only you can tell the story. And the thing that I think is a truism that you often hear about writing or songs is like the more personal it is to you, the more universal it becomes when other people encounter it because it feels authentic.
Yep. It's, I mean, sometimes I will critique bits of fiction and things for other people. And the hurdle that sometimes beginning writers have to get over is you'll read some of their piece and what it will scream is writerliness, in a way where it's like that. I get why they're doing it, but the thing about writerliness is it's also artificiality, where it's like I sense this person taking themselves out of it completely because they don't have faith in what they could uniquely bring to the page, and instead substituting kind of a cardboard cutout of what they think of as a platonic ideal of a writer.
Yeah.
Right. But the truth is what I mean, like you're saying, is that really opening up, I mean, sort of prying open your rib cage and being vulnerable and exposed, that's what clicks with people and feels universal, because we have this innate sense for when someone is being really vulnerable and sincere, and an innate sense for when they're not. And when you see it in writing, that vulnerability, you understand that this cost the writer something, in terms of trust, or living or sitting with that fear of being vulnerable. And when you feel what it costs the writer, then suddenly that writing kind of takes on new weight. And I think that's a really solid foundation for connection and writing resonant work.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think that was when I finally found my fiction voice, was when I got out of my own way and stopped trying to write, oh gosh, this is one of those writer moments I'll never forget. I was at a conference and William Kent, what is this? He writes basically like modern, I would say thriller fiction, but they're smaller stories. It's like, what is his name? I'll put it in the show notes because people are probably screaming right now. But he got up to speak at this conference and he said, he kind of had that academic background too. And he was going to write the great American novel like Hemingway and all this stuff. And then he leaned in really close to the mic and went, fuck Hemingway. And like people actually got up and left, which I thought was really funny. But I was like, he's absolutely right. You can't write Hemingway. That's not how this works. And until you get over yourself and get past that and go, no, my voice is my voice, I think it's really hard to get out of your own way.
I mean, when I was deep into academia, I started to think I didn't like poetry anymore. But I think what I didn't like were academic poets. Not all of them, mind you. But a lot of those folks haven't gotten to the fuck Hemingway stage. And they spend so much time on that capital C canon and looking backward and, revering the voices of past generations that they start to write, pastiche. Like they write backward looking things in imitation of something that isn't, necessarily speaking the truth of our time and place and context. And so if we go back to that artificiality, like that's just a different version of it. To when it's like, all right, you're not really serving your audience or your zeitgeist anymore. So yeah, I think fuck Hemingway is an important stepping stone in any writer's growth.
Yeah. I mean,
Not,
whoever your albatross is, it doesn't have
not
to be.
To single out Hemingway,
yeah. I mean, it could be fuck ass by it. I don't know, whatever your particular hobby horse is. But rest in peace, AS. Sorry, I don't.
I mean, T.S. Eliot was one for me, where it was like, oh look, he wrote this line in Greek, and now it's incumbent upon us to figure it out. And it's like, wait a minute, that's just another kind of affectation. Like that's not. There's nothing particularly special about that. It was just like it's almost like a marketing PR ploy of like, are you in the in club? Like, you'll need my permission to rise to the occasion of writing what I'm putting in front of you.
Well, and even like when he was writing that, I mean, it was kind of at the end of period where people studied classical Latin, Greek in regular schooling. Like, I mean, he was already kind of like on the edge of that meaning to anybody, really. I mean, when you're talking about like a popular audience.
His mentor was also a jerk, and I love a lot of the things that T.S. Eliot did, but again, it was just part of that important process for me and my growth was to like realize that these weren't deities, that it was time to say, yes, I love that, I studied all of this classical literature, but the way in which that serves me is that it gets thrown into the sort of cauldron of my brain, and it becomes part of the ingredients where new and interesting things can emerge from that stew. It isn't that I need to like try to be them,
Yeah. It's very, I think that the deification thing, I mean, it's kind of what the canon does in some ways, or I would say the old canon. I feel like there's been a lot of work since I left academia on kind of tearing that system apart.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
But I mean, I think it is easy when you, especially as a younger writer or just a younger person in general, before you meet some of your heroes and you realize, oh yeah, they too have feet of clay like the rest of us. That it's really easy to deify those people in your brain. Like, I will never be blah, 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 and I'm like, well, that's probably a good thing.
Right. And you can't be, so long as we go back to that premise that like being open and vulnerable about who you are is the soul of good writing. Like, okay, if you're open and vulnerable, what are the chances that what you are inside is the same as what Hemingway was inside or T.S. Eliot? I mean, you're not, like, and you shouldn't be. And what they had to contribute to the world was theirs and their time. And, it's time to see what you can contribute through that honest vulnerability. But it's scary. I mean, I think that's the thing. If a newer writer is listening, like, it's hard and it's scary, and I get that.
I mean, putting yourself out there is a risk. I mean, you're taking an emotional risk when you do that. Right. And I don't want to belittle that anyway, because that is scary. But
and not doing it, you feel like you're going to get away with something. Because if people like your writing and then you didn't expose yourself, well, maybe I'll get praise, but any criticism that comes is okay because that wasn't the real me.
Yeah.
Like, okay, but the praise won't land either because that wasn't the real you. Like, but I get it. I get why it's scary. It's just, it's practice. It takes actual incremental practice, I think, to start to embrace that vulnerability.
I interviewed Jane Meredith on the show, I think a couple years ago. Wow. And we were talking about in the book that she had written, she wrote some pretty raw, honest stuff about like her interaction, romance, like how she felt about her body. I mean, like a lot of stuff. And I said, it just felt so raw and vulnerable. And she said, it's so funny because I think about that as being a different person. Like it was real and it was her feelings, but because it was a past her, like the criticism couldn't land the same way because she was like, well, I'm not that person now. I've moved on to be, who I am now. And I was like, what a great way to look at it. that you're always growing and changing as a person, as a writer, whatever. But also, like, what a great way to protect yourself from people being shitty. So,
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, uh, you know, I'm so itchy about the idea of getting our true self, because it's a moving target. It
mhm.
always will be, and it should be, because,
Yeah.
I'm with you. We're not a separate thing from the universe or from nature. And so nature is always changing, and cycles and sequences and seasons. And so are we. And I think I find that pretty comforting, because, especially somebody who struggles with rough mental health, that it's on the move, that I could be in winter now, but spring is coming.
Yeah.
That it's uh, change, change can seem scary, but, change also brought us everything we love.
Yeah.
And so the idea of wanting to be kind of locked in stone, it's like that doesn't serve us in the way that sometimes it can seem to serve us, I think.
Yeah. I guess, I don't know, maybe riffing on that. I don't know. This is a great segue. Sometimes I'm good at them and sometimes I'm not. But I did want to ask you, like, kind of in terms of like the podcast of like the crypto naturalist aspect, like, I feel like it's kind of an offshoot of your poetry. I mean, like I see the same, thought process and things in that, but like why the podcast? Like what made you decide to jump off and kind of go that direction? Because you do kind of
Yeah.
have a persona in the podcast. I mean, obviously people who
Yeah.
listen will know that you're not talking in your crypto naturalist voice
That's
right
true.
now.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. The podcast, at the time I started the podcast, I was working as a director of external relations for Ohio University, and I was deep in it in academia and wearing a suit most days. And, um, and it felt sort of really stifling for me creatively. And I was on the way out from that job. And, it felt like time, the stakes felt very low, and it felt like time to just get out of the way of myself and do exactly what I would want to do in kind of a playful license kind of way. And like, all right, what do I love? I love speculative fiction, fantasy, sci-fi. Um, I adore nature documentaries. I love poetry. And, I grew up on this nature show called Wild America with Marty Stauffer. It was this bearded guy from Tennessee. And, it was just a single voice, and he'd show up in a swamp and he'd tell you what he found there. And I wanted to do that, but with, fantasy, with speculative, with cryptids. Um, and when people like it, I think what is resonating with them is that half joke tagline of real love for imaginary things. Like I'm bringing my sincerity for my love of the natural world to it. It's just that what I'm talking about happens to be fictional. But, in my writer brain, what I am trying to do is bring the kind of childlike newcomer attitude back. So all of it, in my mind, is a metaphor for how I feel about the real world. The nature outside my door. But when you're talking to grown-ups who have kind of accreted layers of cynicism, I kind of like to do it through magical realism and through fantasy and monsters. And because when I take my 4-year-old on a nature walk and he like will physically shake with excitement because we've found a bumblebee, um, he's right, but it's hard for us to access that sometimes. So, I mean, that Crypto Naturalist podcast for me was like what if I just took a bunch of things I really love and put them together and tried to make it work? And then the other component there is audio fiction. I've always loved it. I mean, I was a kid who had a old timey tape deck and would get big fluffy audiobook tape collections from the library. And I've had insomnia my whole life. So when everybody else was asleep, I would pop in tapes and like quietly try to listen to The Hobbit, So just in pitch black, listening to somebody else read to me, that was always very important to me. And then I think somebody pointed me in the direction of the podcast Welcome to Night Vale. And it's like, oh, you can do this with podcasts. Yeah. And so that I was a goner. And then I was like, all right, I'll assume nobody's going to listen to this, and that's fine. What I just want to do exactly what I want to do. I want to hear this done. I want to create this world and occupy this character. And yeah, the character isn't me, not exactly. In fact, I just finished writing a novel, and my agent has it right now. That is essentially the origin story of that character. And I'm not necessarily good at accents, but what I'm trying to do with that character is there are people I grew up around that sounded like that guy in the CryptoNaturalist podcast. So I'm kind of reaching for one of those folks. And being a character is fun because it really can free you up to have a little bit of distance from yourself. And now on episode, I don't know, 55, when I sit down to write a script for that, I can hear that guy in my head, and that's a different experience from other things I write.
I listening to the podcast, I think I too grew up around people who talk like that because we grew up in East Tennessee. It's that kind of, but for me, the thing I like about it is I always like a little spooky, but not terrifying. Like I don't do like full horror very well, but I like the kind of edge of spookiness to some of the tales. And I don't know, I think it just reminds me a lot of, or it makes, that part of our brains that still remembers oral culture. And that, like, that aspect of it, I think is what clicks for me. And I think that's why I like books on, audiobooks or books on tape as they were. So I think that has something to do with it. But, and I suspect that spooky magical realism aspect of it is part of why you have a witchy following.
Well, I'll tell you though, a lot of people who like my poetry don't seem to even know I have a podcast. As somebody who used to work in marketing, I understand that I have a confusing brand. Because, I write very sincere nature poetry and nonfiction. And I also have this bizarre scripted fiction, magical realism podcast. But it came naturally. It came from me starting to give myself permission to do a collection of things I care about. So in that sense, it makes sense. It's cohesive in my head, Yeah.
I don't know. It's funny. I have never thought that about it being disjointed. Maybe that's because I also have a confused brand myself. So that could be.
I sympathize. Yeah. It's funny you mentioning the horror thing too. Some other folks have pointed that out to me, and I like to say that like some CryptoNaturalist episodes, it's like they were supposed to be a horror story, but then the wrong narrator showed up. Like horror is such a matter of perspective and sort of like leaning into that like sort of feeling exposed and vulnerable, and like you don't have agency, and there's the panic in that. It's like being in a fight in a dream and all your punches are in slow motion, but like that's not who the CryptoNaturalist is. He's excited to be there. So, it kind of like takes the horror away.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like but part of what's scary is the unknown. And this guy studies this stuff and is excited to study it. And so it's a different kind of overall tone.
Yeah, it kind of, I don't know, like it's in that, for people who haven't listened to the podcast, the way I would describe it is the Richard Gere Mothman movie, but with a Appalachian narrator.
Right. Yeah. Which would make sense for Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the Mothman.
Because it's like that edge of spookiness without you ever really feeling like you're 100% in danger.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's like this, it's like Appalachian narrator, but it's also the 15th time that he's encountered the Mothman.
Yeah. Old hat.
Yeah. Also, a heads up if you listen, I don't do any real cryptids, real um
Mhm.
in quotes, but I make up everything. So it'll
Yeah.
be a bunch of creatures that you've never heard of because the podcast invented them.
Which makes it, I think, even more enjoyable. It's like, because once they appear in the podcast, that I'm like, maybe that makes them real now.
I like to think so. I mean, part of the reason I did that is the freedom to not have to navigate kind of existing lore, the creating from whole cloth.
Yeah.
But the more I do it, the more the whole world of that podcast starts to feel like a place. It starts to feel like a door inside my head where I can go to that environment, and it's fun.
Yeah. I do recommend people listen to the podcast, but I did want to, we talked about this a little bit before. So for people who are listening, I'm not putting Jarod on the spot, I promise. But I would really love if you would read something from Leafletter, and you don't have to do it in your CryptoNaturalist voice. Obviously, people can go listen to the podcast, but I would love if you would share something you wanted to from the book.
Yeah, so
or
I have
something,
a few,
not necessarily from Leaflet if you've got something else, but
I have a poem open from Love Notes from the Hollow Tree. Why don't we start there? And
okay.
I opened it because I thought I'd say a couple things about nature poetry, just because I'm not sure. Have you had other poets?
I've had a couple on.
Okay, all right.
They're a little harder to get on a podcast for some reason.
That's funny. But anyway, like when I write nature poetry, I want to kind of tie it to our earlier conversation about meaning and finding meaning in the natural world. I often think that there are kind of two primary approaches to nature poetry that I write, and one is taking a lesson from the natural world and then applying it to my own mind, and the other one is kind of encountering a snag or a problem in my own mind and then looking to the natural world for kind of lessons or a place to build meaning. And so with that in mind, let me read Forsythia, which was the first example where I make an observation about the natural world and then try to use that to build meaning that is useful in my own life. Forsythia. As forsythia grows tall, its branches bend beneath their own weight, bowing to the ground in arches of yellow flowers. Wherever they touch the earth, the branches root again and send up new shoots, stitching gold across the landscape. Some new kinds of knowledge shift our center of gravity, staggering us, bending us low beneath the burden. If you think of your worldview as a stone tower, this shift is a cataclysm of splintered rock. If your worldview is forsythia, then every startling truth that bends you low becomes a new connection to the earth, a new way to stand, an invitation to grow. We live in a time of strong wind and sudden pressure. It's not an age for towers. It's an age for stubborn flowers.
Oh, thank you. That was lovely.
Thanks. And that's a poem that sort of comes from my backyard of struggling with forsythia and how tough and resilient it is, and feeling kind of a compulsion to remove it as I move to the landscape of our newer house here to more native plants. But, in that resilience and sort of stubborn strength, I sort of found a lesson about my own life and anxieties about the world we live in. And so, I've written poems that are just like, hey, this waterfall is really pretty. But also, most of the time, what I'm doing is trying to do that work of creating meaning in concert with the natural world, which, is very much the kind of magic that I'm preoccupied with.
I would say I think that might be your other overlap with witchcraft.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And, it's when I was talking about all those diverse audiences, like they all share such similarities to me in terms of like motivation. And I don't know, I want to build a coalition of all of these people because they have so much in common. And I think that's becoming clear there's a lot of rough stuff about the internet, but one nice thing is like what we're doing today, where you connect people with similar interests over distance. I mean, I live on a one-way road in rural Ohio next to a cemetery, and
Yeah.
you know, I don't reach out and connect with anybody if not for things like this and social media.
Yeah.
So I get itchy about a lot of aspects about social media, but I try to remember the bright side.
Yeah. I mean, and there are some, like, I think about that too. Like I mean, I live in Silicon Valley. I'm in San Jose. But I'm also kind of a hermit. I've worked at home for years before the pandemic, and
Sure.
it's just easy to kind of get in your own space and not think about that. And then COVID was like a great excuse to like fully embrace my hermit nature. And so I'm trying to crack out of that shell, which hermitage and anxiety, I mean, they do go together a lot. So it's been a constant struggle for me. It's like, have I left the house in a week? I should check.
Yeah, depression too. I mean, I've done a couple local readings and signings lately, and they felt really medicinal. And it was that sort of epiphany of like, oh yeah, I should leave the house and see human faces. Because I work from home, and also like we had our first child, and then 6 months later the pandemic hit. And so we both got such in the habit of never leaving the house. And then that kind of goes with my depression anyway, of the, well, I don't think I need to put on pants today kind of feeling that I often have to work against.
Yeah.
Here's another poem that's an example of the other approach, where I look at a problem sort of in my own life and then take it to nature to see what sort of conversation we can have. So this one's called Shelter. Often, my mental health does not cooperate with my creative goals. Often, does not cooperate is an understatement. I frame this as brain weather. Sudden snow may disrupt my gardening plans, but the snow is not being malicious. It's not my enemy. It's just the weather. During my decades of storms, I have found that I can strengthen my shelters and sharpen my forecasts, but I still don't steer the clouds. I find this metaphor helpful. Natural hardships aren't punishments, nor do we own them. So we should not blame ourselves for our struggles to stay warm and dry. That's also what I think of as a note to self poem.
Yes. That note to self is a great way to describe that. I know, like, my brain is going, can we just do like a 2-part episode? But I am so far behind in getting stuff out that I can't really afford to do that. So we'll move toward ending this in a somewhat timely manner. But I wanted to give you, so this will come out in June, and folks, we're recording this is February. This is how far behind I am. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to like tell people where to find you, where to find your books. And I guess the pre-order should be available for your...
it will be then.
So.
Okay, cool. So the pre-order for my memoir, Something in the Woods Loves You, is now up, and you can find information about that at my website at jarodkanderson.com, or on any of my social media platforms. You can follow me at CryptoNaturalist most everywhere, or at Jarod K. Anderson. So I'm out there, and I'm really proud of that nonfiction collection. It's essentially a lot of people reach out to me to talk about nature and depression, and with every one of them, I want to have a 2-day long conversation about it. And so that book is that conversation, and it's essentially about my relationship with nature, and how I moved away from nature at a period of my life when I was sort of very distracted and very ill with largely unacknowledged mental health issues. And that book is about the journey back, both to having a handle on my mental health and to remembering and re-embracing my relationship with nature. So I'm very proud of it.
And I'll put links in the show notes so folks can have those.
Cool.
And then, so our last question is a little bit of a game of chance. And I always joke that it's either, being a nosy writer or being a Scorpio or, the double threat combination of them both, that I like to talk about things we're not supposed to talk about. So I will roll the die, and depending on what I roll, you'll get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. If I roll a 6, you get to pick which one you want. And because very little rules, you can say pass. I don't want to talk about that. So 6, you get to pick.
Oh, let's do the death question.
Okay. So you mentioned in your bio, and it comes up in some of the poems, that you live next to a cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, I find that there are no dead people at the cemetery. What is your experience of that?
I love the cemetery. So a thing that I've said before that sometimes gets me a strange look is that I think the cemetery is adorable. And I think my wife may have originated that adjective in this household, but I mean, our cemetery is also an arboretum. And so it's just this place of towering trees and islands of woodlands and hillsides, essentially dotted with little stone love letters to people who have gone before. And it's a place where I see ritual in action constantly. And I see people, drive up in muddy work trucks and get out and kneel and have conversations with people who have departed, and sometimes they'll stand up and kind of look around self-conscious and get back in and drive away. And my cemetery is also an island of woods between like a river and then there's a lake, and so bald eagles will come and land high in white pines. And I'd say I walk the looping trails of that cemetery 3 times a week. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of a place that feels wholesome to me. There's tragedy in the cemetery, of course there is, but the cemetery is for the living. It's not for the dead. And what I see there and how it reflects on the living strikes me as lovely. I mean, it's a bunch of people who may not think of themselves as whimsical or may not think of themselves as being interested in ritual, kind of being drawn to it naturally, like a moth to a porch light. And it, I think it's kind of encouraging. Yeah.
It's funny. So my sister listens to the podcast, so she'll know the story. But I went home to East Tennessee in November and for wedding, and my sister and I spent a whole day tracking down family cemeteries because my mom's family is all from East Tennessee. And I just kind of got this thought that, like exactly what you said, the cemeteries are not for the dead, they're for the living. And they tell a story to the living. And sometimes that story is tragic, and sometimes that story is fascinating, or, and one of the things that I think is interesting, especially growing up in the South, because there are so many small churchyards and, they're just kind of dotted everywhere. And sometimes you'll just drive down the interstate and there'll be like this random little fenced off cemetery next to the interstate. And like, I appreciate the interaction that the living have with those cemeteries. Like Decoration Day is still a big deal in a lot of places in the South, and for those who are not Southern, Decoration Day is kind of what became Memorial Day, they're kind of related. But basically it was the time you went to the cemetery and had picnics and put flowers on your loved ones' graves. And my family's done that for years with the family cemetery. And so it's just interesting to me, but I love this idea of it being adorable. Like I think that's the first time I've heard someone use that adjective to describe a cemetery, and I love it.
I mean, you can see the sort of local fireworks from ours. So it gets filled with families with blankets and picnics on the 4th of July. And I think some of them are sitting with loved ones. And Halloween, it fills up. And, ours is, it has graves from the American Revolution, and so like the local historical society will put on events where they'll sort of dress in period things, and you can go visit a president's parents' grave and so on and so
Mhm.
on. And I mean, it's just adorable is the word.
Yeah.
One of the a strange moving thing happened to me a couple months ago, and somebody's a woman had passed away from cancer, and her family reached out to me because in her farewell letter she included one of my poems and asked one of the poems to appear on her headstone. And they sent me a copy of the letter and a picture of the headstone, and oof, that one
Wow.
really got me, because I it's just sort of, it's kind of like being deep in the forest. I feel like there's just an air of sacredness in general around cemeteries and around
Mhm.
death, and um, in death in terms of being kind of a conversation with nature, of kind of a homecoming, kind of the our blood, the iron in it that came from the hills, and
Mhm.
um, the way all of our matter is from and passes back to nature. And I don't know, seeing a picture of a line from one of my poems on a headstone was really an interesting benchmark in my career as a writer.
Yeah. I mean, most of us don't get to see our words chiseled in stone.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I wrote back and said, "Could you put my name and my website on there too?" And no, no, I didn't. No, but but yeah, it was. I walk around and read headstones so much, that the idea that somebody would encounter that in the wild was really moving to me.
One of the things that stuck with me on our trip, my sister and I are jaunt around East Tennessee. Um, so the family cemetery is in this like little very rural community, not far from where I grew up. But the first grave in the cemetery is a little lamb on top of the stone because it was a child that
Yep.
died, like within a year, I think, of being born. And that's they always say the first grave is the keeper of the cemetery. And there's this idea, I guess, in my head thinking about this infant really who's the spirit of the cemetery. And to me, I think, and they just resodded it. So we went, it was just beautifully green and
Mm,
it's so well taken care of. And it has a little clapboard church, the whole thing. And I was like, that is the perfect keeper of the cemetery. It looks innocent. It's
yeah.
just a beautiful place. And that's where my grandmother is. And, so it was just really lovely to kind of be reconnected to that in that moment of thinking about it that way.
I mean, I share a fence with the cemetery here, and like I walk over there with my 4-year-old constantly, and he practices letters on the headstones, and we gather hickory nuts and take them home, and
Mm-hmm.
acorns and black walnuts, and um, yeah, I'm so far away from being able to think of a cemetery as spooky or,
Mm-hmm.
as a
Yeah.
Halloween decoration at this point in my life. That
Yeah. I mean, we did
um,
kind of have a weird spooky experience. So one of the cemeteries it's one of the oldest ones there. It's like the some of the first ancestors that came to East Tennessee. And it's not as well taken care of. And it's bifurcated by a road, which is weird, like
mm,
with no fencing or anything, it's just like out in the woods. And one of the oldest graves in the very back, like the land has subsided and there's been some erosion and stuff. So you could see the top of a casket.
oh, huh.
And I was like, I'm not concerned that anything's going to come out of there, but I also don't need to see it.
Yeah,
Like
sure.
we're like, perhaps this is not the thing we want to do tonight. And it was getting
Well,
dark, and we're like, man, maybe
I've
it's time to
never
go home.
I've never seen a ghost, but I have a whole lot of backyard campfires, and I'm usually out
Mm-hmm,
there next to that cemetery fence in the middle of the night with a
mm-hmm,
fire, especially with insomnia and wanting to be out in the. So
mm-hmm.
I have an extra chair. So if any of them ever want to join me, they'd be
Yeah,
welcome.
yeah. I always think though that like if a spirit has lingered for me, I think I've seen a ghost a couple times, but if a spirit has lingered for me, they're probably going to be where they lived. They're not going to be at the cemetery.
Mhm.
Like that to me, that's just not where they would hang out.
I mean, I'm there all the time, and I think I put out a very friendly vibe. So I
Mm-hmm.
feel like if they ever needed to say anything to me, I hope they know that they'd be
Well, good.
welcome.
Yeah, I like that idea. Oh, Jared, thank you so much for coming on and for sharing your poetry and your work and your own vulnerability and talking about writing and what that's like. So I appreciate
I
it.
Pleasure. I could do it all day. I love these topics.
Awesome. Well, let's do it again. Maybe when your memoir comes out.
Yeah, that'd be lovely.
Sounds
Yeah,
good.
anytime.
All right. All right. WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press and is edited by Julian Rashke. Our intro music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew K, and our outro music is Voices by Alexander Shenekar. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Threads at witchlitpod. Please help other witches find us by leaving a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to and reading WitchLit.